If Jesus is God, then he is all-knowing. But if he is all-knowing, then Jesus knew that he was not going to sin, since God doesn't sin. But if Jesus knew he was not going to sin, then his temptations were basically a joke. That's a mind-boggling dilemma for sure. But even if Jesus was all-knowing and unable to sin, his temptations were still real. And this video will show you why. For starters, consider the following scenario. You've committed yourself to a diet and to not eat sweets for a month. It's day 23 and you're sitting in the kitchen as your flatmate returns with 3 bags of your favorite gummy bears, which you're craving so badly. He puts those bags away in the kitchen closet while you're sitting there sipping away on your vegetable soup. The mere sight of those sweets is so tempting that it's unbearable, so you decide to take your bowl of soup and go to the living room to finish it. You dare not to go back to the kitchen lest you crack and start binge eating the gummy bears. And for the final 5 days of your diet, you pledge to not even open that kitchen closet, as you're determined to finish your diet victoriously. However, little do you know that the very evening your flatmate got those gummy bears, he actually ate them all, just 5 minutes after you left the kitchen. So the fact is that during those final 5 days, you were literally incapable of eating those gummy bears, since there were no gummy bears to begin with. Did your incapability take away from your sense of being tempted? No, not in the slightest. The temptation during those 5 days was 100% real, just as real as it had been had the gummy bears still been in the closet. Thus, in order to undergo real temptation, we need not be able to do what we're tempted to do. Therefore, even if Jesus was incapable of sinning, this in itself doesn't undermine the genuineness of his temptation. Now, at this stage, you might object and say, sure, the guy in your analogy may have been incapable of eating those gummy bears. However, he didn't know that the gummy bears were gone. Had he known that there were no gummy bears in the first place, he wouldn't have felt any temptation to eat them. Jesus, however, is God, and God is omniscient, which means that Jesus knew that he wasn't capable of sinning. The problem still stands. But what if Jesus wasn't actually aware that he could not sin? So, just as Jesus was not aware of the timing of his return, he may well have been unaware of his inability to sin. If so, he'd have been in the exact same position as the gummy bear defier of our analogy. To this, the skeptic will likely object, but now you're only making matters worse. If Jesus didn't know these things, how could you possibly claim that he was God, given that God is omniscient? If Jesus is God and God is omniscient, Jesus must be omniscient too. Again, not so quick. If Jesus was truly God and truly man, he had both a divine and a human consciousness. So according to his humanity, Jesus was not omniscient. That's why Luke writes that Jesus grew in wisdom, or again, why Jesus said that he didn't know the day and hour of his second coming. According to his divinity, however, Jesus was omniscient, knowing all things. Now, you may think to yourself, but all this talk about according to human consciousness and according to divine consciousness doesn't make any sense. How on earth can a person have 2 consciousnesses? Well, even as human beings, we have different levels or modes of consciousness, and we divide them roughly into the conscious and the subconscious. So there are all sorts of stuff which you know in your subconscious, and yet your conscious isn't aware of it. Or take lucid dreaming, where a person is experiencing at one and the same time 2 levels of consciousness, the one that's within and the one that's outside the dream. Now, one model of the incarnation suggests that while Jesus was on earth, his divine consciousness was submerged under his human consciousness, or that his dominant consciousness was the human one, whereas his divine consciousness was somewhat dormant. In other words, the relation between Jesus' divine and his human consciousness was somewhat analogous to that of one's subconscious and one's consciousness. And this is how Jesus could both be divine and not know certain things consciously. In other words, according to his divine omniscient consciousness, Jesus certainly did have knowledge about the timing of his second coming. And yet, because this consciousness was submerged under his human consciousness, Jesus wasn't aware of that piece of knowledge. Going from here, we can make the case that according to his submerged divine consciousness, Jesus did have knowledge of his incapability to sin. However, according to the dominant human consciousness, under which his divine consciousness was submerged, he didn't know about it. In this sense, Jesus' condition does in fact reflect the condition of the guy who resists the temptation to eat the gummy bears. Just as the guy wasn't aware that the gummy bears were gone, Jesus wasn't aware of his inability to sin. Yes, Jesus was unable to sin because he is God. And yes, Jesus, being God, does know all things, including the timing of his return or the fact that he can't sin. However, if this knowledge was laying as part of his divine consciousness dormant under his human consciousness, then he wasn't aware of it, just as we are not aware of knowledge our subconscious possesses. And so we can confidently say that the temptations of Jesus were as real as the temptations any human being experiences. One last thing. At this stage you might say, well, this is all sweet and nice and we may be able to put the issue of Jesus' temptation to rest. However, we've simply assumed all along that Jesus, being God, was incapable of sinning, since God is supposedly incapable of sinning. But isn't God omnipotent? That is, isn't God capable of doing anything, and doesn't anything include sinning? Well, great question, and it's the one I'm answering over here. So go on to check out this video. Thank you for watching and see you in the next one.